Hey everybody out there, my name is Dragnix, and I set my critical eye today on ICEY. ICEY is an action indie game with RPG mechanics that came to Steam on November 17th, 2016 for $10.99. At first glance, it may remind gamers of another beloved indie game, Dust: An Elysian Tale. It's got a striking art style that focuses on flowing combat and high combos similar to Dust, so I can see where the comparison comes from. But can it live up to that level of gameplay and the cult-like status? That's what I'm here to find out. So the premise of the game is this. You are ICEY. You have no memories, and all you know is that your entire existence is made to kill Judas, who's apparently the devil of this fictional world. I mean, the name sort of gives it away. And that's the plot. Kill the evil guy, save the fictional world. Now granted, ICEY does have a trick or two regarding its storytelling, but let's start this review by analyzing the gameplay. Just trust me on this one. You'll see later on why I started here. So the gameplay controls as a 2D action side-scroller, which focuses on close-range Fnatic gameplay. You've got a strong and light attack and the ability to dash forward, which acts like a dodge. The game expects you to avoid enemy attacks while hitting combo after combo, as higher combos will give damage bonuses. While you can purchase secondary abilities, the majority of your arsenal will come from the different combos that you can use and their situational usefulness. Some will knock enemies around positionally, while others will stun them for a tiny bit. There's a lot of combos here, and the technical players out there will enjoy what they can pull off. The game has a good sense of flow in combat for the most part. While hitting aerial combos can be a little tricky, going from enemy to enemy is entertaining, keeping up the combo while attempting to dodge attacks. Now we're not talking Dust levels of combos here, where you get into the thousands, but pulling off a 100 combo is satisfying, especially when the game is throwing a lot at you. In addition, I feel like there's a good skill level here, especially when attacking in the air. I found myself taking a second to orient myself to keep a combo going, because the game is pretty precise when it comes to hitting enemies in your range. There's no magnet effect like you see in other games where all of a sudden your character is able to magically hit someone, so from that standpoint, I like this combat. As to enemy variety, it is hit and miss. There's a good amount of base enemies in the game, and they have some different attacks and defenses that you really have to watch out for. But as to the strategy of those base enemies, it doesn't really require you to change up your strategy that often. This game is more about execution rather than tactics when it comes to the main combat. And while that's fine, it did leave me wanting a little bit more out of these smaller fights. Luckily, the game has a good series of boss fights to make up for some of that. The boss fights do hit a good spectrum of different mechanics, forcing you to step back and maybe play a little bit more passively at times, or try to figure out where the boss's weak spots are. You've got fights such as Carlos, who will rip you apart if you're in front of his mouth and pincers, but has trouble with more overhead attacks. Then you have the doll fight, which forces you to be a lot less aggressive and focus on hit and run tactics because he'll punish over-aggression. The boss fights were definitely the highlight of the game, and there were a bit more of them than I expected when I first started the game. So okay, you may be saying to yourself, Dragnix, you seem to say a lot of good things about the gameplay, but yet you sound like you're hesitant to say it's great. What gives? Well, you'd be right in that, mostly due to one main problem that I have with the combat, and that is everything to do with its difficulty. One of the biggest drawbacks is the ability to hit for a significant amount of damage when dodging at the right time. Think bullet time from Bayonetta. Now that on the surface sounds like a good thing, but here's the problem. You can spam the dodge so much and activate that ability without a lot of skill put into it, meaning that boss fights may end up easy because you spam the dash. And well, that sorta sucks. In fact, almost every fight can be gotten through in this way, and sometimes you can end up hitting multiple times during an attack for a huge chunk of damage. I don't see the punishment for dodging at the wrong time in this game, and the game really wants you to always be dashing. An enemy or mechanic that forced a little bit more restraint on the player would have gone a long way. Even when playing this game on hard, I did die, but frankly, I didn't die enough. Now, the game does have some particularly brutal points, don't get me wrong, such as this combo that annihilates me in one hit. But that's more of an outlier than a regular thing. If you go in not wanting brutal difficulty, you're fine. But for me, the hard mode was a disappointment in difficulty in the end. And there's one other thing that I really need to mention. Just as I was starting to feel like the game was opening up and really getting into the groove of combat, I found myself at a particularly funny screen. The credits screen. It took me about 2.5 hours to play through this game on the hard difficulty. Now look, for me a shorter game is not usually a problem because it usually means that the game has shown all it could and it doesn't want to stay around longer than it needs to be. Think of a game like the original Portal. But not for ICEY. I felt like, wait, give me more of this stuff. Now, I could go back and play levels and go down different paths in those levels, but when I've already defeated the end boss, it seems like a bit of a letdown at that point. I wanted more content here, even if the content was quality to begin with. That's the overall theme that you should take out of this review. Basically, the game is good, but it could have been fantastic. One or two changes here and there, and I see this game being a real smash hit even in the mainstream audience. And well, given the strong reviews, it still is. However, I don't think it will stand the test of time like Dust will. Over time, people will forget about it, but with a couple of changes, it could have been a classic. Where I will give the game a lot of credit is the aesthetic. Usually a clash of neon lights and darker, more detailed environments don't work for me on a visual level. But that's definitely not the case in ICEY, where you can see the individual detail put into the bush and tree work in both the foreground and the background. And yet, it never really gets in the way of actual combat. Environments like the Metro car give the game a lot of character, even if some of the imagery is a little bit on the head. I mean, okay, you're making America comparison. You could be a little bit more subtle about it, game. As to the performance of the game, it's mostly there. But every once in a while, the game has a moment where it has problems. What's weird is that these issues seem to happen more outside of the action-oriented combat, which is good, but makes me wonder why it's happening in the first place. But I mentioned something at the start of this video about the storytelling that you're probably wondering about. See, when it comes to the actual plot behind the game, it's sort of bare bones. There's a narrator and he's telling you what's going on and how ICEY is making her way to kill Judas. In terms of other characters or plot points, there's absolutely none. Which is weird considering the comparisons that the game is getting to Dust, which had a lot of those missing elements. And yet, I'm hearing people loving the writing of this game. So it's got no plot, yet the writing is good? What gives? Well, it's because the game knows it's a game, and has an overarching storyline that exploits the meta of that idea. Think along the lines of the beginner's guide for this. As you go along, you find little hints that, hey, this is a game, even pretending to talk about the level design and overstressed workers behind the game itself. Hell, the game basically comes out and asks you to rate the game high. I'll admit, that got smiles out of me. It's nicely done, and I would love it if it also came along with some real storytelling within the game. The problem I have is that it is the main focus, not in tandem with the story of ICEY herself. In my mind, the best way when meta is used is when the meta plays off the plot and the plot plays off the meta. Why was ICEY given this task to kill Judas? How does it mirror the real world, and who programmed it? It's possible that I missed some side stories that explain that, but the lack of the main plot on the main path of the game, it just doesn't sit well with me. It feels very much like an afterthought, and well, I'm sorry, I just don't think the meta aspect is as impressive as others are making it out to be. In the end, ICEY is a good game, don't get me wrong, but I feel like it's a step off from being a must purchase. The lack of content as you go along does hurt the game, despite a detailed combat system and a wide amount of bosses. you can't help but want the game to challenge you more despite your deaths, and I think when it comes down to it, I wanted more from the story elements. Nevertheless, it is a beautiful game and worth playing at some point. Just maybe a good sale target for those who are patient.